My name's Linda Rowley and I'm delighted to be facilitating this webinar for you today. Before we move on, let's just check off a couple of housekeeping items. So when you've joined the webinar, you have been muted automatically. It would be great to have some interaction throughout the webinar. So if you'd like to pose a question, tell us about your experiences or share your thoughts, please feel free to unmute yourself and contribute. Or the other way you can contribute is via the chat pane, which is just down on the left-hand side of your toolbar. If you are experiencing sound or video issues throughout the webinar, we do recommend that you sign out and back in again because sometimes that helps. Otherwise, we do have a recording of the webinar which you can access. Post the webinar, if you have any questions, feel free to contact the NDP at any time, just via their info email address. So that's info@ndp.org.au. So let's talk about embracing individual change. This webinar is one of 2 webinars that has been developed for the National Disability Practitioners. The other one, of course, focusing on managing workplace change, and this one has more of an individual focus. So how do we as individuals navigate our way through workplace change? And again, my belief, and perhaps yours too, is that change should be meaningful, should be fun, and it should inspire people to become their best self. So my personal why, as you can see for individuals, is aligned to the organisational why as well. And yet we know that whether it's within an organisational context or an individual context, this can often be difficult for people. Because when we hear the word change, we automatically perhaps think about some of the things that we're going to lose or things that are going to be taken away from us. We don't automatically think of those opportunities and the benefits that the change might bring. So today we're looking at a couple of different tools and also a roadmap, if you like, for navigating your way through change. We know that personal change can elicit a range of responses and can be difficult and challenging. So as I mentioned, we'll be exploring some key concepts, resources and tools in this particular webinar. So as an overview, we'll be looking at 3 main areas. So the first one is managing your emotions and gaining acceptance. And acceptance is the key to making any change, and yet it can often be hard won or a difficult thing to do. So our second chunk is to look at some tools for decreasing stress and gaining more of a sense of control. So we'll be looking specifically at the ladder of inference, which has been developed by Chris Argyris, and we'll also be taking a bit of a look at the circle of influence and how we can use that from a personal perspective. Our third and final chunk for this webinar is looking at developing resilience and also embracing change, because we know that change isn't going to go away. Change is a constant, meaning that it is an ever expected condition. And I think that if we expect change, then we are less likely to be rattled by it and perhaps more likely to embrace it. So there are some specific things that we'll be looking at within that intentional change model that's been developed by Robert Byatzis. So we'll be looking at how we identify our best self, develop a personal why, elicit our values, so start to unpack those things that are most important to us, how we identify our strengths and articulate them in a way that we can use them in a practical sense in our day-to-day. We'll also look at our individual way we respond to change and what that might mean in terms of the support we need. We'll also talk broadly about the positivity mindset and how that can be helpful in terms of setting out to achieve goals, and also the growth mindset. So this is the work of Dr. Carol Dweck. And the growth mindset, I think, is particularly useful when we're trying on new behaviours, experimenting and working our way towards new and different goals. And then to wrap up that piece, we'll also be looking at the support we need during change. So all of those elements are covered under that intentional change model, which is where we'll spend the bulk of our time together on the webinar today. So let's have a look at our first piece, managing your emotions and gaining acceptance. I love this quote by Socrates. The secret of change is to focus all of your energy not on fighting the old, but on building the new. And yet for most of us, when we think about change, we spend lots of effort focusing on what we're leaving behind. So intentionally turning our mind toward that which we are facing, the future, can be really beneficial. Dr. Marsha Lynham, some of you might be aware of, she was the developer of dialectical behaviour therapy. She suggests that when we come across any painful problem, we have 4 options. And I think sometimes we can look at workplace change as a painful problem. It's something that can create a range of mixed emotions for us. So let's have a look at those four options and what they are. So the first option is to solve the problem. Is there a way that we can actually work through the problem to a resolution? And that might be, finding out more information. It might be gaining different perspectives. It might be, enlisting the help of others to look at how we can actually work through the problem for ourselves. Now, if we can't solve the problem, then our second option is to change how we feel about it. Now, that can sometimes be easier said than done, but sometimes changing how we feel, all it might take is to start looking at some different perspectives. So are there other people that we trust that we can go to challenge perhaps our perspectives? Can we put a different hat on and see things a slightly different way? Because it's often the way we think about things that influences the way we feel, and then of course how we act. So second option, see if you can change how you feel. Can you look at it a different way? The third option is to accept change. Now this is one that can be a bit challenging, especially if you haven't chosen the change. So if you feel perhaps the change has been forced upon you, if you haven't had much say in what the change looks like, or whether you buy into the change or not, or if you simply don't agree with the change, it can be really difficult to accept. However, we often conflate these things. Accepting a situation doesn't mean that you have to agree with it, nor does it mean that you have to like it. So liking and agreeing with something are very different from simply accepting something. Accepting something is letting go, unhooking from the emotion, and just realizing that it is what it is. And that doesn't mean trivializing what's happening, and nor does it mean that emotions aren't justified. It simply means letting go and accepting that it is what it is. And the fourth option then, the fourth and final option, is to stay miserable. And I think this is an option that not many of us would choose, and yet often it's one that most of us fall into. When we're struggling with a painful problem or with change, we often fail to lift our head up and to see the options that are available to us. So I think this is a really useful model in just thinking about, okay, how can I respond to this change? Can I solve the problem? Can I change how I feel? If not, what do I need to accept it? What's going to enable me to let go and to move on? And of course, if we can't do any of those, to accept then that the only option available left to us is to stay miserable. That is, of course, unless you can identify any other options. But when I looked at this, I sort of thought, yeah, you know, I think that's pretty much right. I don't think there's any others that I can identify. So sometimes just reflecting on the fact that we do have options if we're angry or upset about a situation, and these are the options that we have, can help us to have more of a sense of, you know, self-efficacy around being an active agent and having choice about how we respond to that particular situation. I love this quote, without acceptance there is no change, and that is to move on with anything, we first need to accept it and to realise that, you know, we are not prisoners of the past. We have a choice. We can either tie ourselves to the past that we have, or we can make an intentional decision to create our future. And much of the webinar today is going to be about how we can use some intentionality around that future we might create for ourselves. Before we do that though, we're just going to have a bit of a look at the grief cycle. So this, of course, was developed by Elisabeth Kübler-Ross as an example, I guess, or a framework for what can happen when people experience loss. Now, we know that the grief cycle, some people will experience it, others won't. We know that some people will experience every element of the grief cycle and some only others. So there's no, while it's called a cycle, it's not a linear process. Some people go backwards and forwards throughout the process. And there's no specific, you know, time limit to grieving or, you know, feeling loss as well. But I think as a conceptual model, it identifies what happens for most of us when we feel a sense of loss and when we're grieving for something. So in the workplace, that sense of loss could relate to working in a particular organisation. It could relate to the people that we work with if we're moving on into other roles or other organisations. It could also include feeling a sense of grief around familiar environments and routines, or even working with the people that we support if we're moving in again into a situation where we might no longer have contact with them. So when we're talking about organisational change and how it impacts us as individuals, there's a lot of different things that, you know, can impact on us to a greater or lesser degree. And I think, you know, honouring that and appreciating that there is no right or wrong in terms of emotions, that all emotions are adaptable. We experience them all for a reason, is really validating and is really of value. So I think it's about, you know, being kind to yourself and also practicing a bit of self-care around, you know, what you might be going through. And of course extending that to the others that we work with as well. So some unhelpful ways of dealing with emotion are bottling. So this is suppressing your emotions, not letting them to the fore or dealing with them in a constructive way. Now, while this might be an effective, very short-term strategy, in the long term it's harmful to us. It's harmful to our bodies, to our cardiovascular system, and it's also harmful to those around us. We now research, we know this thing called the emotional contagion, and that is that our emotions impact the other people around us. If we bottle our emotions, some research suggests that the people around us will actually experience an increase in their blood pressure. So not entirely sure how that one works, but it's good to be mindful that while we might say everything's fine, don't worry about it, it certainly still has an impact not only on ourselves, but on those around us as well. Of course, another common unhelpful way of moving through emotions is brooding. And this is when we ruminate. So ruminate is going over and over and over the same thing. And for some of us, we get stuck. We get stuck in that cycle. And what then can happen is we start to co-opt other people. So we encourage others to co-brood with us. So we might invite, our bestie or our colleagues at work out for a cuppa numerous times to talk about the same thing over and over again. And while I think we don't ever want to underestimate the impact of support, co-brooding with someone isn't the most supportive thing to do. Sitting there listening to them, validating them, and also helping them find solutions can be really positive, but not getting down into the pit with them. So, if we're brooding, if we're stewing on things or around somebody else who is, this can be really unhelpful, again, both for ourselves and for others. It doesn't enable us to move through our emotions in the way that we need to. So there's a couple of things that we can do. The first thing is to be aware of our own and others' emotions. And one of the things that the neuroscientist Jan Siegel says is that we need to name it to tame it. If we're able to accurately identify the emotion and to give it a name, we are more likely then to be able to effectively manage the emotion. And sometimes just naming the emotion helps to take the energy out of that emotion as well. We know that people who have more of an extensive vocabulary around feelings and emotion are more likely to be able to identify them and work with them through their emotions. The other thing we can do is look for helpful ways to express our emotions. So Dr. James Pennebaker has done some fascinating research where he has people write about their emotions for at least 20 minutes a day for 4 days in a row. And what he's found is that when compared to control groups who just write about anything for the same period of time and the same duration, the people that write through their emotions are more likely to move on, to have better health outcomes. There was even one study where there was a group of engineers who had been retrenched from their work roles, and he split them into two groups. So one group of engineers just wrote about anything they wanted to for 20 minutes for 4 days in a row. The other group of engineers wrote about what was happening for them in terms of losing their jobs, being retrenched, and their emotions around that. And the outcome of that research was the suggestion that those engineers who were writing about their emotions 3 months down the track were more likely to have been re-employed in other positions and, to be generally doing better than the group who just wrote about anything they wanted to. So if you're interested in writing as a way of expressing and managing emotions, I'd encourage you to look up James Pennebaker's work, and there's some great resources on the internet around that. So managing your emotions is key in relation to looking at how we minimise the negative impact of change and how we can start to develop our resilience so that we're not getting change fatigued, especially when change is a constant for us and ever evolving. So let's move on now to number 2, and this is some tools for decreasing stress and also regaining control. So the tools that we're looking at specifically start with the ladder of inference. Now, some of you may be aware of the ladder of inference. This is the work of Chris Argyris, who developed the tool quite some time ago now, and it was made popular in Peter Senge's book, The Fifth Discipline. So the ladder of inference can be used as a reflection tool. It stops us taking it, that little bit of information that we have, and making assumptions about it, and then jumping to conclusions which force us to act in unhelpful ways. So it's a great reflection tool. It helps to clarify any assumptions we might have about particular situations. And it can also relieve some of those negative thought loops that go, around in our minds, and also unnecessary worry. I came across a bit of information recently that said that at least 70% of our thoughts are either redundant, meaning that we've had them before, or they're negative. So the ladder of inference can really be helpful when it comes to those redundant thoughts, and also the conclusions we might make based on assumptions that we have. So we're going to work our way up the rungs of the ladder so we can have some examples here. So the very bottom rung of the ladder is the observable data. This is the reality and the facts of the situation. So if we were video recording the situation, this is what we would see. We would be able to see what the situation looked like. We'd be able to hear what was going on. But basically, it's everything that's happening in a given situation at that point in time. So the next rung up the ladder then is our selected reality. And this is where we take a portion of the observable data and focus on that specific portion that we've selected. Because we know that our brains can't focus on everything at any given point in time. So we have to select the data that we take in. From this data we've selected, we then interpret our reality. So we start to add meanings, because we're meaning-making machines, us humans. From that we can derive assumptions, then draw conclusions based on the assumptions that we have, which then lead us to believe certain things about the situation. And it's from our beliefs that we then act. But the issue with this ladder of inference is that once we get to actions, we're very high from the ground, and we often can't see the data, what was happening in the first place. And we get a couple of recursive loops happening. So our beliefs then feed back down into what we select in terms of reality, and our actions then can influence the observable data. So let me give you a concrete example. I'm a facilitator, and one of the workshops I facilitate is called Facilitation with Flair. So it actually invites people to consider and improve their own facilitation skills. So my observable data, the bottom rung of the ladder, the reality and facts, was that I was facilitating a workshop for a group of about 16 people. Now, that group of 16 people, most of them were fairly engaged with what I was saying and were actively participating. But I noticed one person, so this comes into my selected reality, the next rung of the ladder. I noticed one person who just didn't look very engaged. And I'd been told prior to the workshop that this person wouldn't be attending, and yet they turned up on the day. So my selected reality was instead of focusing on all of those people that were engaged, I started to just focus on this one person. And when I focused on this one person, I then jumped up to the third rung of the ladder, the interpreted reality, and made assumptions that, oh, she doesn't like the training, yeah, she's not getting any value from it. So the conclusion I drew from that was that she thought the training wasn't worthwhile. I won't say what I really thought, but she thought that the training wasn't worthwhile. Let's go with that. That's the conclusion I drew. But then I started to personalize it, and it wasn't only the training that I thought she didn't think was worthwhile. I actually started to think that she thought I wasn't worthwhile or of any value. So this was the belief that I was then running off. You know, she wasn't engaged, she didn't like the training, she didn't think it was worthwhile, and she didn't think I was of value. So based on that then influenced my actions. Because I had this negative, you know, those negative thoughts going around in my head, I know that as a facilitator, I actually wasn't as engaging. I wasn't, you know, giving as much eye contact to the group, and particularly not this specific woman. So my actions then created that recursive loop back down to the reality and the facts. Because I wasn't being as engaging, that impacted then the behaviour of the group as well. So I hope that's a good example that you can see kind of how we tend to go from observable reality and facts all the way up to, you know, jumping to conclusions and having those influence our actions. Now, just to finish that off for you, I went up to this lady after the workshop and I said, you know, thanks for coming along. I wasn't sure you were coming today. I'd been told that you wouldn't be, and, you know, I'm not sure really how much you took away from this. And she said, oh, she said, look, she said, I really like the training. She said, but I've been off for 2 weeks. She said, I was away sick. She said, because of a death of, you know, a close, a person very close to her. So in all of the stories I was creating in my head, that was not one that I thought of. And often when we jump to conclusions or make assumptions about things, we often draw the wrong conclusions. So when we're going through change, when there's lots of uncertainty for us, it's easy to select kind of one piece of data, one piece of reality, and to make assumptions about it, especially if we don't have any other information. This tool can help you climb back down those ladders so you can start to question, well, how did I actually draw that conclusion? You know, what did I base that assumption on? You can start to open up your thinking and, you know, just sort of think, well, is there any other way of looking at this? You know, what other perspectives are there? You can also make your thinking more transparent. So again, find someone you trust and sort of say, look, you know, this is my take on the situation. What's yours? You know, do you have a different perspective? And don't agree to disagree too readily either, because often when we agree to disagree with people, we don't flesh out the underlying assumptions. So, you know, having some exploration and discussion around, you know, what's happening for yourself and others can be really useful. And in terms of getting back to the ground, what is the observable data, and relieving yourself of some of that unnecessary angst and worry that can go along with change, particularly if we're making assumptions about situations. So I hope that's helpful. The next tool is the Circle of Influence, and this was originated by Stephen Covey, and of course many of you would be familiar with it through the person-centered tools and practices of Helen Sanderson Associates. So in the outer circle there we have our circle of concern. This is where situations or events that concern us, but we can't do anything about, would go. So Some of the concerns I hear in relation to the NDIS that people have are concerns like, well, you know, what about the NDIA planners? You know, what if they don't have the expertise they need? Well, that is a concern, but that would go in our circle of concern. While we're concerned about it, there's probably not much we can do about it. Another concern might be job security. You know, if my organisation restructures, what do I do about a job? And again, in terms of job security, you may not be able to influence if your organisation restructures. The middle circle is our circle of influence, and this is where those situations or events that concern us, but we can do something about, so we can influence them in some way. This is where they would go. And then our very centre circle is our circle of focus. And this is where we put those things that we can influence, but we want to prioritise. So this is our prioritisation. Where do we want to put our energy and effort? What do we want to focus on? So if we take the example of job security being a concern, for instance, while you mightn't be able to influence whether your organisation restructures or not, you may be able to influence your skills and knowledge. So you can think about, you know, training, professional development. You might start thinking about, you know, your career, or you can perhaps, you know, find out more information about the NDIS. So some of those things would go either in your circle of influence or in your circle of focus. And the benefit, I think, of this tool is that it helps us reflect on where we can take some responsibility. So it helps us to let go and accept those situations or events that we're concerned about and can't do anything about. But it also means that we're able to take some action and some personal responsibility for those things that we can influence and that we want to prioritise. So it also provides us with a positive focus on the things that we can control and enables us to develop an action plan. It increases our sense of self-efficacy, so that's around feeling like we have a bit more, you know, positive choice and control, and also that we're more effective, and as well as being more efficient and more productive, because we're not spending time focusing on those things that we can't do anything about. We are dedicating intentionally the energy and effort that we need to progress towards those things that we can change. So let's now have a look at what we can do in terms of developing our resilience and how we can move toward embracing change. So this is a simplified version of the intentional change model that was developed by Richard Boyatzis, and now he's a professor at the Case Western Reserve University. And I think this model can be used if we're going through big change, so change that's significant to us. It can also be used, I think, through workplace change, and is particularly beneficial for career change. So it would be used, I guess, to a greater or lesser degree, depending on the context of the change for you and what's happening at the moment. So a brief overview of the model, and then we'll dig a little deeper into each of the elements and the tools and strategies that we can use to achieve some of those elements. So brief overview starts off with my ideal self. Who do I want to be? What do I want to achieve and be like? And this could be, you know, visioning the future you, your best possible self in 10 years' time, if we're talking about something significant. Or it could be, if we're going through workplace change, struggling with it a bit, not dealing with it particularly well. It could be my ideal self is, you know, being able to roll with the punches, to identify the opportunities in the change and to look at how I respond better. So from my ideal self, we then have a look at what they call my real self. I'm not sure about the wording of that, but this is about, you know, where am I now? So in relation to my ideal self, what's happening for me now? And then moving on to the third element down the bottom there, what do I need to learn or to change to close the gap between, you know, being more of the person I'd like to be and where I see myself at the moment. Following on from that, of course, we need to experiment and practice. If we're going to change the way we do things, then we need to develop new behaviours and new habits. And of course, we need to practice those and to drive us towards our ideal conception of who we want to be. And then, of course, in the very middle there, we have supportive relationships, because supportive relationships really underpin this whole model. At every stage, you know, having the support of those near and dear to us, or peers, colleagues at work, is important in terms of, you know, helping us achieve what we want to achieve. So let's have a look at the first element, which is my ideal self, or who I want to be. So one strategy you can use for conceptualizing your ideal self is to just imagine, you know, what's the best possible life that I can have. If it's a big change, you might want to consider all of the relevant areas of your life. So you might look at your career, study, if you're doing further study, relationships, hobby, health, wealth, all of those things. What would happen in those areas of your life if it was your best possible future? And think about, you know, how would you be feeling, behaving, thinking, and, you know, what would you be saying? What would other people be doing and feeling and saying as well? So be very specific, lots of colour, be vivid about that picture that you're painting in relation to the best possible life you could imagine. And when I do this, I find that I have kind of like a real sense of energy around it. So hopefully that might be the case for you too. If the change you're going through isn't kind of that significant in terms of wanting to visualize your best possible life, you might just think about, well, you know, going through the changes I'm going through at the moment, what would be my best possible self in terms of that, you know? Could I be more compassionate? Could I be more open, more curious about what the changes might bring? So scale this exercise down to the magnitude of the change that you're facing, so it suits your cause. So then you might want to develop some goals around your ideal self. So some goals that have a bit of forward momentum. Make a list of the things that you're passionate about or you would like to achieve. And again, get specific, you know, what's the purpose of the goal? Why are you doing it? What outcome will it get for you? So, you know, how will things be different once you have or get this? And then once you've done that, imagine something goes wrong. And think about how you would respond. So this is doing a bit of kind of personal risk management around this. In neuroscience, it's called implementation intentions, and that is that when we think about those things that could possibly go wrong and develop strategies or workarounds for them, we are more likely to be persistent in the face of adversity, particularly when achieving our goals. And of course, we would apply the SMART framework. So there's lots of different words that make up the SMART acronym. The ones I use from a coaching perspective are specific, measurable, attractive, so it has that forward momentum, realistic and time framed. So check your goals off against each of those criteria. And then, of course, you would develop some short-term as well as long-term goals, because short-term goals help us to stay motivated along the way. We get those quick wins and that little buzz, you know, about having achieved what it is we wanted to achieve. And I think it's about, you know, maintaining that choice awareness that we can choose to focus on the past, or we can focus on the future and act from our best selves. I love this quote, and I'm not able to attribute it to anyone. I don't know who said it, but it's, I'm on the hunt for who I've not yet become. And I just think that's a wonderful quote in terms of, you know, working towards being all you can be. So let's have a look at the second element now. The second element is my real self, or it looks at, you know, where am I now? Who am I now? So we have a couple of different tools and strategies to help you think about your real self. And the first one is to find your why. Now, this is the work of Simon Sinek, who's a business and management consultant, and he works a lot with organisations around finding their why, but also has some strategies for individuals in terms of developing their why statement as well. So your why is the purpose, cause, or belief that inspires you. So in terms of identifying your why, one of the things that you can do is think about your most meaningful personal and professional experiences. So what are those situations or events, those shining moments that really stand out for you? Those ones that make you so proud, you know, to have done what you've done. You can partner with a trusted person and share your stories with them so that they can coach you to start to drill a little deeper into those stories and find out what it is behind those that is so important to you. So from this you can develop a why statement. So a why statement involves two things. So the first thing is contribution, and the second thing is impact. So what is it that you have contributed? What have you done? And what was the primary action that you took to achieve what impact? So what is the difference that you want to make? So a personal why statement would usually be a kind of a framework that would start with to, and there would be your contribution. So it might be to support or to raise awareness or to train or to educate, but something that you'll be doing so that. And then following the so that is where you would put the impact, the difference that you want to make. So it might be, you know, to raise awareness of breast cancer so that you can, you know, reduce the number of deaths, or it might be to educate carers so that they're able to represent themselves or the person that they care for in an NDIA meeting, but you know, whatever it is. So it's to do something so that you can achieve a particular outcome. And then, of course, you need to take action based on your personal why statement. So one of the things that's closely aligned with our why are our values, and these are the things that are important to us. And of course we have values in all of our different life aspects. So we might have values that are particular to our life values. We might have career values, financial values, relationship values. So there'll be slightly different things that are important to us in each of those elements of our lives. So think about what's important to you in your life, and also from a career perspective, if that's an element that you want to focus on. Drill down into detail so that you can communicate your values in a nutshell. So if you and I were having a chat, coaching conversation, you'd want to get really to the nitty-gritty so that I could easily understand those things that are important to you. So 1 or 2 words for each value. maybe try and get a list of about 8 to 10 values and then look at how you can prioritise those. So what's most important to you and what's least important. And it sounds really easy, but it's actually really hard to do. So then think about, you know, how will these values help you to come closer to your ideal self? What is it about them that is congruent with who you want to be? And if your values currently aren't congruent, if what's important to you now doesn't align with your ideal self, then maybe, you know, doing some reflection on that around, well, you know, have I got my ideal self? Is it a good fit? Is it where I really want to be? So the third thing then to look at is your strengths. Now, there's lots of misconception around strengths. Lots of us think that a strength is something that we're good at. And that's right, but it's only part of the story. A strength is not only what we're good at, it's also what energizes us, what we're passionate about. You know, those activities that we look forward to, the ones that we get into the zone or we get into flow. You know, time just kind of flies by while we're doing them. Because if you think about it, if you really think about it, there are probably things that you're good at that you don't actually like doing. And you wouldn't really want to do those all day, every day, irrespective of how good you are at them, because they're just draining. You would end up fatigued. So when you are looking at your strengths, think about not only what you're good at, but also those tasks or activities that energize you. Now, before we go on, I'd love it if you could just spend just a moment or two checking out this slide. Now, I appreciate that maths is not everybody's strength, but I'm wondering what you notice. And those of you who are live on the webinar, is there anything that you particularly notice about the figures on this slide? If you could type it into the chat box, that would be awesome. Okay, so you may have noticed that the bottom equation does not equal 11, yet the top three do. So when I demonstrate this slide in a workshop, what people often notice is that the fourth equation, the bottom one, is wrong. Very few people, actually, I haven't had anyone that's actually said to me, oh, the top three are right. Generally, what people say is the bottom one's wrong. And I think this tends to be indicative of how we often see things and where we put our focus and our attention. We tend to focus more on our weaknesses, those things that aren't right, than we do our strengths, those things that are right. So this is just a bit of a reminder to actually start looking through a strengths-based lens can help you to develop your resilience, to reduce stress, and to also be more productive in terms of what you do. So how do we get specific with our strengths? Think of an activity that you love doing. Now, it may be at work or it might be outside work. And then drill down into what it is most about that activity that you enjoy. So you might want to consider these things. Does it matter what specifically you are doing? So what type of task or activity? Does it matter who you do it for? And finally, does it matter why you do it? So the purpose or outcome or the result. Now this comes from the work of Marcus Buckingham, which suggests that, and I know the Gallup poll did some research that indicates that the two most common answers to interview questions around, you know, telling us your strengths and weaknesses, the two most common answers are I'm a people person or I'm a numbers guy. So if you think about that, being a people person doesn't actually really tell us much about how you use your strengths. It doesn't tell us what people you like liaising with. Is it older people? Is it people with disabilities? Is it people who are looking to make a sale or go on a holiday? But, you know, what types of people? It also doesn't tell us, you know, what you're doing for them. Are you selling to them? Are you caring for them? Are you supporting them? You know, are you nursing them? And it also doesn't tell us why you do it, you know. Is it so they can regain their health? Is it so they walk out of the shop pleased because they've bought the latest, you know, plasma TV? So you need to get much more specific than just, you know, being a people person. If you really want to drill down into your strengths and find jobs, roles, or tasks that you really love to do. So be as specific as you can, and then of course find more ways to do those activities at work, or to find a role that enables you to do that. Some of the research says that even if we use our strengths just 5% more of the time, which is about 24 minutes a day, I think, then there's an improvement in our happiness, our resilience, and also reducing our stress levels. So the final thing in relation to looking at who and where you are now is give some consideration to how you respond to change. There are 8 common responses to change based on personality type theory, or the Myers-Briggs type indicator. So doing some reflecting on, you know, whilst you might do a number of these things in terms of responding to change, there's probably one that fits a little better for you than the others. So have a think about that. And also, given that this is the way you typically respond to change, what do you need in terms of support? How can you communicate that to, you know, your manager or those around you in terms of garnering that support so that changes are more positive and effective for you? So let's now move on to the next element of the model, which is, okay, so I've visualized my ideal self. I've done a lot of reflecting and thinking about where I am now. What do I need to learn or change or do to close the gap between them? So one thing you can do is develop a personal change or personal development plan. And of course, this will be different for everyone. It should include those things that, that I've just got listed on the slide there, so purpose and outcomes, actions, some indicators around your progress so you can get some feedback along the way, as well as the resources that are available to you, and of course those implementation intentions. What are you going to do if you hit a snag along the way, as well as the other people that can support you. Because everyone's personal change or personal development plan is going to be different, I'm not going to focus on specific actions here. What I'm going to talk about are 2 mindsets that can be really helpful in terms of closing the gap, and particularly in relation to experimenting with new behaviours and practicing new habits. So the first one is promoting positivity. Now, Dr. Barbara Fredrickson, a quote from her, she's a positivity researcher. She says, "Positivity transforms us for the better. By opening our hearts and minds, positive emotions allow us to discover and build new skills, new ties, new knowledge, and a new way of being." So her broaden and build theory suggests that when we experience positive emotions, it builds what she calls our thought action repertoire. And that means that we're likely to be more creative, more innovative, to think of, you know, new and fresh ways to do things. And it also improves our ability to cope successfully with what life throws our way, and also enhances our well-being as well. So you can see there positive emotions listed on the right with our negative emotions on the left. So her research suggests that for each of us as individuals to flourish, that is to have a really good level of mental well-being, we need at least 3 heartfelt positive emotions to every 1 negative emotion. So what can we do in terms of promoting our own sense of positivity? We can create a mindset of positivity. So that is cultivating emotions, being open to new experiences, not having a closed-minded approach, being appreciative, so showing gratitude. And, you know, there's lots of research now around how gratitude diaries or journals, focusing on 3 things you're grateful for at the end of every day, can be really helpful in terms of happiness and well-being. Being curious, you know, about what's happening, being kind, and also being real, being genuine in our interactions. So positivity isn't about being positive. It's not about being Pollyanna, you know, and just squishing the negatives. It's not 3 to 0, it's 3 to 1. Still important that we have the opportunity to really feel and express those negative emotions, but also to focus on how we can promote more positivity in our lives as well. So the second mindset that I think is helpful is having a growth mindset. Now, this is the work of Dr. Carol Dweck, and she distinguishes between 2 mindsets, the growth mindset and the fixed mindset. And what she suggests is that most of us have a more fixed or growth mindset, depending on the particular area of our life that we're looking at. People with a fixed mindset tend to see their abilities or their intelligence as being limited, being fixed at a set point. So they see themselves as either being good at something or just not good. And they won't try. They don't tend to persist in the face of adversity because they don't like to be challenged. And they think, well, either I can do it or I can't. If I can't do it, there's no point trying. So they see their potential as being predetermined and tend to give up when they get frustrated. They also tend to take feedback fairly personally, particularly if it's critical or constructive. So they tend to stick to what they know. People with a growth mindset, on the other hand, see failure as an opportunity to grow. They like to challenge themselves, to learn new things, and they see that they have the ability to do, learn, be anything if they put their mind to it. So they see that their effort and their attitude determines their abilities. They're not fixed. They get inspired when they see other people succeed, and they like to try new things and see feedback as constructive, as being helpful. So thinking about those 2 mindsets, you can probably see that having a growth mindset is going to be way more beneficial, particularly if you're looking at making changes, at, you know, extending yourself, stretching so you can learn, grow, develop, fail, but in the end get to where you want to go. So Carol Dweck has, there's a mindset quiz that you can do to just check your mindset and see where it is. So I've just popped that on the slide there. It's quick, it only takes, you know, a few minutes, and of course it's free, so could be helpful. So getting to the final, the underpinning tenet of the intentional change model is those supportive relationships. So thinking about your best self, your personal why, values, strengths and approach to change, how would you like others to support you? Doing some reflection on the support that you would need or want from others, and then communicating that in a way that's positive can be really helpful to yourself and also helpful to others. They don't need to second guess what support you might need when you're able to clearly articulate it. One thing you can do is create a professional or a one-page profile. So one-page profiles were initially developed by HSA, Helen Sanderson Associates, and tended to be used more with people who access services and had things like, you know, things that we like and admire about them, what's important to them, that sort of thing. So this is a little different professional profile. You can use it to enhance your own self-awareness. If you're looking to change roles or careers, it can support your job-seeking strategies. It helps people to support each other and improves teamwork and also supervision. So some of the things you might consider including would be, you know, I feel supported when. So tell people how they can best support you, how you use your strengths at work. So what are the tasks, activities or positions that you could take on that would enable you to use your strengths? What's important to you, so this is your values, as well as how you like to communicate. So how do you communicate best? And of course you might also add your personal why statement to that professional profile as well. And this then becomes a communication tool that you can use with your teammates, managers or others who support you so they can support you best, particularly when you're going through change. All right, so just looking at the time, we do need to finish up. So in summary, what we've covered in this webinar, managing your emotions and gaining acceptance. We've looked at 2 tools for decreasing stress and regaining a sense of control. And we've also looked at the intentional change model and its elements and how it can be helpful in terms of helping us to develop resilience and embrace the changes that we're going through. So in closing, thank you all very much for your for participating in this webinar. Please, if you do have any further questions post the webinar, feel free to email the NDP on info@ndp.org.au. Thanks everyone.